Your employment at Seoul Medical Center is terminated effective immediately.
He was coding. He was dying on the floor of a public corridor. What was I supposed to do? Check his insurance before I started chest compressions.
Your employment at Seoul Medical Center is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you out. Grace Mensah stood in the hospital director's office in her pale blue scrubs, her stethoscope still warm around her neck, her hands still smelling like antiseptic from the surgery she had assisted in 40 minutes ago, the surgery that had saved a man's life, and listened to a woman in a designer blazer end her career in one sentence. She didn't sit down. She didn't cry. She looked at the director, Dr. Yoon Soo-jin, a woman whose smile never reached her eyes and whose heels cost more than Grace's monthly rent, and said, "He was coding. He was dying on the floor of a public corridor. What was I supposed to do? Check his insurance before I started chest compressions?" Dr. Yoon didn't blink. You were supposed to follow protocol. The patient was not assigned to your ward. You overstepped your authority. You used restricted surgical resources without authorization, and you disrupted the workflow of an active surgical team. I saved his life. You endangered this hospital's liability. Grace stared at her. Beside Dr. Yoon, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and a smile that made Grace's skin crawl, was Dr. Han Jae-won, chief of surgery, golden boy of Seoul Medical, and the man who had refused to treat the patient in the first place. He had looked at the man bleeding on the corridor floor, a man in a torn, bloodied suit with no ID, no insurance card, no hospital wristband, and said loud enough for 3 nurses to hear, "He's not our patient. He's not on our surgical schedule. I'm not risking my record for a John Doe who probably got stabbed in a gang fight." Then he had walked away. Grace had not walked away. Grace had dropped to her knees, started compressions, called a code, commandeered a crash cart, and when the man's heart stopped for the second time, she had looked at the surgical resident frozen beside her and said, "Help me or move. Those are your 2 options." They had saved him, together, in a corridor. With equipment Grace had pulled from a supply room she technically did not have authorization to access, and now she was being fired for it. Dr. Han pushed off the wall and straightened his white coat. "For the record," he said, "I recommended against this course of action, but Grace has always had a problem with boundaries." Grace looked at him. She wanted to say something, several things. Instead, she unclipped her hospital ID badge, the one with her photo and the title, Registered Nurse, and the name she had worked 8 years to earn, and placed it on Dr. Yoon's desk. "His blood type was AB negative," Grace said quietly. "The rarest type there is. If I had waited 4 more minutes for your protocol, he would be in the morgue right now instead of the ICU. But sure, fire me for having a pulse." She turned and walked out. She did not know that the man in the ICU had been awake for 12 minutes. She did not know that he had heard everything through the open door of his room. Every word, every accusation, every silence where someone should have defended her and didn't. She did not know his name, but he knew hers now, and Kang Do-hyun never forgot a debt. If you believe she deserved better, so I smash that subscribe button right now. This story is about to deliver karma so precise it should come with a receipt. Don't miss a second of it. Let's go. Grace Abena Mensah was not the kind of woman who gave up on things. She was 30 years old, Ghanaian-British, born in Kumasi, raised in South London, and transplanted to Seoul 4 years ago for a reason that most people found either inspiring or insane, depending on how they felt about ambition. She had wanted to work in one of the best trauma hospitals in Asia. Seoul Medical Center was ranked 3rd in the continent. Their emergency department handled cases that hospitals in Europe referred patients away from. Grace had read about them in a nursing journal at 23 and thought, that's where I want to be. It took her 7 years to get there. 2 years to finish her advanced trauma certification in London. 1 year to learn enough Korean to pass the medical language proficiency exam, which she failed twice before passing on the 3rd attempt with a score that her instructor called stubbornly impressive. 1 year of paperwork, visa applications, and credential transfers that nearly broke her. And then 3 years on the floor at Seoul, working doubles, volunteering for every shift nobody wanted, earning a reputation that the nursing staff summarized in 4 words. Grace doesn't go home. She was the nurse the ER called at 3 a.m. when a case was too complicated for the on-duty team. She was the nurse the surgical residents trusted to catch their mistakes before the attending noticed. So she was the nurse who had once held pressure on an arterial bleed for 47 minutes because the surgical team was delayed and she refused to let the patient die waiting. 47 minutes. Her arms had shaken for 2 days afterward. She loved the work. She loved the patients. She loved the hospital. What she did not love were the 2 people who had just ended her career. Dr. Yoon Soo-jin had been director of Seoul Medical Center for 3 years. She was 51, immaculate in presentation, ruthless in administration, and possessed a talent for making cold decisions sound reasonable. She had not become director by being kind. She had become director by understanding that a hospital was a business first and a place of healing second, and that the metrics that mattered, liability exposure, insurance reimbursement rates, or regulatory compliance scores, were the metrics that kept her in her corner office with the view of Namsan Tower. Patients were statistics, nurses were costs, doctors were assets, but only the ones who generated revenue. Dr. Yoon did not dislike Grace specifically. She disliked what Grace represented, a nurse who made decisions above her pay grade, who treated every patient like a moral obligation regardless of their billing status, and who, most dangerously, was occasionally right in ways that made the hospital's official protocols look heartless. Grace was a liability wrapped in compassion, and Dr. Yoon had been looking for a clean reason to remove her for 6 months. The John Doe in the corridor was that reason. Dr. Han Jae-won was everything a Korean hospital drama would cast as the leading man, and everything a real hospital would quietly warn new staff about. 36 years old, handsome in the polished, symmetrical way of someone who had never been told no, son of a former hospital board member, graduate of Seoul National University Medical School, chief of surgery at Seoul at an age that raised eyebrows among everyone who understood that his surgical skills, while adequate, were not what had gotten him the title. His father's connections had gotten him the title. Dr. Han operated on patients who had insurance, status, or names that would look good in the hospital's annual report. He did not operate on unknown men found bleeding on corridor floors, with no identification and gang-style stab wounds. He had looked at the dying man and made a calculation, not a medical one, a career one, and walked away. But Dr. Han's relationship with Grace was older and uglier than one incident. He had asked her to dinner 8 months ago, casually, as if it were nothing. As if a chief of surgery asking a nurse he had authority over to dinner was a simple social interaction and not a loaded weapon. Grace had said no, politely, clearly, without leaving room for reinterpretation. "I don't date colleagues," she said. "But thank you." Dr. Han had smiled and said, "Of course." Then, over the following 8 months, Grace's shifts had quietly become worse. Her schedule rotated to the least desirable hours. Her requests for advanced training opportunities were denied. So her performance reviews, previously excellent, suddenly included phrases like difficulty with authority and, occasionally, bypasses established workflow. Grace noticed. She documented. She said nothing. Because she knew how these things worked. She knew that the moment she accused the chief of surgery of retaliation, she would become the problem instead of him. So she put her head down and did her job, until the night the man collapsed in the corridor and Dr. Han walked away, and Grace did not. Now she was fired, and Dr. Han was leaning against the wall, smiling, and the system had worked exactly the way it was designed to work, protecting power and punishing anyone who challenged it. The man in ICU room 4 had been awake for 12 minutes before anyone realized it. The monitors showed stable vitals. The IV dripped at the correct rate. The surgical site, a deep stab wound to the upper abdomen, repaired in a corridor with equipment that was technically unauthorized, was clean and holding. But his eyes were open, and he had been listening. Kang Do-hyun did not move when he woke up. He assessed. This was fundamental to who he was. A man who never reacted to a new environment until he had understood it completely. He was 33, head of the Kang Syndicate, the most powerful criminal organization in Seoul that wasn't technically criminal because every operation ran through legitimate business structures so complex that prosecutors had spent 4 years trying to map them and given up. He had been attacked the previous night, an assassination attempt by a rival faction that had gotten closer than any attempt in 7 years. His security chief, Sergeant Bayek, had been 8 minutes behind him. The ambulance had arrived in 11, but in the space between the stabbing and the ambulance, a woman had found him. He didn't remember her face. He remembered her hands, steady, precise, pressing something against his wound with the kind of focused pressure that told him she had training. He remembered her voice, accented English, talking to him, saying things he couldn't fully process, but that anchored him to consciousness the way a rope anchors a boat in rough water. Now, lying in the ICU, he had heard that same voice through his open door. He had heard her defend herself. He had heard the director terminate her. He had heard the surgeon, the one who had refused to treat him, take credit for the recommendation. And he had heard her place her badge on the desk and walk out. Do-hyun lay still for a long time after the door to the director's office closed. Then he reached for the nurse call button. A young nurse appeared, nervous, wide-eyed, clearly aware that something about this patient was different, because 12 men in dark suits had arrived in the lobby 3 hours ago and hadn't left. "The nurse who saved me," Do-hyun said. His voice was quiet, controlled. The voice of a man who was used to asking questions that were answered immediately. Her name. Sir, I'm not sure which. The black woman, British accent. She was just fired. I heard it happen through that door. Her name. The nurse swallowed. Grace Mensah? Do-hyun nodded. Send in the man waiting in the lobby, the one in the charcoal suit. His name is Bayek. The nurse left quickly. Sergeant Bayek arrived in 90 seconds. Square jaw, gray-templed cropped hair, the posture of a man who had been standing at attention in a hospital lobby for 6 hours without complaint. Sir. I need 3 things, Do-hyun said. First, everything about a nurse named Grace Mensah. Her file, her history, why she's in Seoul, where she lives. Second, everything about the director of this hospital, Dr. Yoon Soo-jin. Her finances, her decisions, her vulnerabilities. Third, everything about the chief of surgery, Dr. Han Jae-won. Particularly anything that explains why he refused to treat me and why he seemed personally invested in having the nurse who did treat me removed. Beck nodded once. How long? Do-hyun asked. Director and surgeon, 6 hours. So, the nurse, 3. Start with the nurse. Beck turned to leave. Beck. Sir. She saved my life in a corridor with a crash cart and a frozen resident while the chief of surgery walked away because I didn't have insurance. Then they fired her while I was 20 feet away. A pause. I want to understand the full architecture of what just happened. Every decision, every person involved, every reason. Beck looked at him. How thorough, sir? Do-hyun met his eyes. The kind of thorough that keeps me up at night thinking about it. That thorough. Beck left. The Korean Mafia Boss just heard everything. He knows who saved him. He knows who fired her. He knows who walked away. And he just sent Sergeant Bayek to find out everything. What do you think happens next? Drop in the comments and subscribe, because the karma coming in this story is surgical. Let's keep going. Beck's file on Grace Mensah arrived in 2 hours. It was thorough. Grace Abena Mensah, age 30, born in Kumasi, Ghana, raised in South London from age 11, mother deceased, ovarian cancer, Grace was 17, father alive, retired teacher in London, 1 younger sister, currently at university in Manchester. Grace had paid for her sister's tuition for 3 years. She was still paying. Education, advanced trauma, nursing certification, King's College London. Korean medical language proficiency, level 4. 4 years at Hanyul Seoul Medical Center. 3 commendations, 0 disciplinary actions until the last 8 months, during which her file had accumulated 4 separate concerns about conduct. Beck had flagged the timing. The conduct concerns begin in March, Beck said. 8 months ago. What happened in March? Dr. Han Jae-won was appointed chief of surgery. Do-hyun was quiet. There's more, Beck said. 3 nurses on Dr. Han's floor submitted informal complaints about his behavior in the last 2 years. All 3 complaints were reviewed by Dr. Yoon's office. All 3 were dismissed. 2 of the nurses subsequently left the hospital. 1 transferred to Busan. And Grace? She filed nothing, but her schedule changed significantly after March, moved to overnight and weekend shifts exclusively. Her application for advanced surgical training was denied despite qualifying. Her most recent performance review contains language that contradicts every previous review. Do-hyun read the file in silence. He asked her out, Do-hyun said. It wasn't a question. I believe so, sir. The pattern is consistent with retaliation following rejection. Do-hyun closed the file. He thought about a woman in scrubs kneeling on a hospital floor, performing chest compressions on a man she didn't know, while the chief of surgery walked away because the patient wasn't worth the risk to his record. He thought about that same woman standing in a director's office, being told she was fired, while the man she saved lay 20 feet away. He thought about what kind of system fires the person who acts and promotes the person who doesn't. The hospital's primary funding, Do-hyun said. Where does it come from? Beck didn't need to check. 60% government allocation, 22% private insurance billing, and 18% comes from 3 corporate donors. A pause. The largest corporate donor is Hangsang Group. They provide 11% of the hospital's annual operating budget. Who controls Hangsang Group? As of last year, the majority shareholder is Doosan Capital Partners. And who sits on the board of Doosan Capital Partners? Beck almost smiled. He didn't. He never did. But the corner of his mouth acknowledged the question. You do, sir. Do-hyun looked at the ceiling. So I fund 11% of the hospital that just fired the woman who saved my life. That is correct. Interesting. Grace walked out of Hanyul Seoul Medical Center at 7:14 a.m., carrying a cardboard box containing a spare pair of sneakers, a framed photo of her mother, a pocket pharmacology reference she'd had since nursing school, and a coffee mug that said World's Okayest Nurse that her sister had sent from Manchester. That was everything. 4 years compressed into one cardboard box. She took the bus home because she couldn't afford a taxi. She sat in the back row with the box on her lap and didn't cry because there were other people on the bus, and Grace Mensah did not cry in front of strangers. She cried when she got home. Her apartment was small, a studio in Mapogu, with a window that faced another building's wall. She had chosen it because it was clean, quiet, and exactly what she could afford while sending money to her sister every month. She sat on her bed with the box beside her and cried for 11 minutes. She timed it, later, when she thought about it. 11 minutes. Then she washed her face, made tea, and sat at her small table and tried to think clearly about what came next. Her work visa was tied to her employment at Hanyul. Without the job, she had 90 days before her visa status became a problem. She had savings, enough for 3 months of rent if she stopped sending money to her sister. But she couldn't stop sending money to her sister. She could apply to other hospitals, but a termination from Hanyul, especially one that cited unauthorized use of restricted resources and failure to follow protocol, would follow her. In Seoul's medical community, which was smaller than people realized, a firing from the third-ranked hospital meant doors closing before she could knock. Dr. Yoon had not just fired her, she had made her unhireable. Grace sat at her table for a long time. Then she opened her laptop and started writing. She wrote down everything, every shifted schedule, every denied application, every conduct concern that appeared after March, every interaction with Dr. Han that had felt wrong. The night in the corridor, what he said, who heard it, what she did instead. She wrote it all down because Grace Mensah didn't give up on things, and if the system was going to destroy her, she was going to make sure there was a record of exactly how it happened. She did not know that someone else was building the same record, with considerably more resources. Kang Do-hyun checked himself out of Seoul Medical Center on the third day, against medical advice. His personal physician would continue his care privately. He had no intention of spending another night in a hospital that had fired the woman who kept him alive. He checked out quietly. No confrontation, no announcement. He simply left, flanked by Sergeant Bayek and 4 others, and got into a black car that was waiting at the service entrance. The hospital administrators didn't know who had left. They would find out soon. Week 1. The funding review Hangsang Group, the hospital's largest corporate donor, funded through the chain of holdings that connected, eventually, to Kang Do-hyun, announced a routine review of all charitable allocations. Standard language. Nothing alarming. Except the review specifically requested documentation of Seoul Medical Center's patient care protocols, staffing decisions, and any recent personnel actions involving patient safety incidents. Dr. Yoon received the request on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, she had a headache that would last 2 weeks. Week 2. The complaint. The Korean Medical Ethics Board received an anonymous but meticulously documented complaint regarding the chief of surgery at Seoul Medical Center. The complaint included a timeline of schedule manipulations targeting a specific nurse following a rejected personal advance, 3 prior informal complaints from other nurses, all dismissed without investigation, performance review language that contradicted previous assessments, and a detailed account of a chief of surgery refusing to treat an emergency patient in a public corridor based on the patient's lack of identifiable insurance. The complaint was not written by Grace. She didn't know it existed. It was compiled by people who compiled things professionally, the same people who mapped financial structures for the Kang Syndicate's legal team. They were very, very good at documentation. The ethics board opened a formal investigation within 72 hours. Dr. Han Jae-won received notification on a Friday afternoon. He laughed and called his father. His father made calls. The calls didn't work this time. Week 3. The audit Hangsang Group's funding review concluded that Seoul Medical Center's personnel decisions in the previous quarter raised concerns about whether patient safety was being prioritized appropriately. The review recommended a temporary suspension of the annual donation, roughly 11% of the hospital's operating budget, pending a satisfactory external audit. 11% of a hospital's budget disappearing is not an inconvenience. It is a crisis. Dr. Yoon sat in her corner office with the view of Namsan Tower and understood, for the first time in her career, that she had made a mistake she could not manage her way out of. She didn't know who was behind the funding review. She didn't know who had filed the ethics complaint. She didn't know that the unknown patient from the corridor, the John Doe with no insurance, had walked out of her hospital 3 weeks ago with 12 men and a debt he was now collecting. She just knew that the walls were closing. Week 4. The fall. The Ethics Board investigation found sufficient evidence to recommend suspension of Dr. Han Jae-won's surgical privileges pending a full disciplinary review. The evidence was comprehensive. The retaliation pattern was clear. The 3 prior complaints, dismissed by Dr. Yoon's office, were reopened. The 2 nurses who had left the hospital were contacted. They had stories. They were willing to tell them now because the climate had shifted, and the protection that Dr. Han had always enjoyed had evaporated like fog. Dr. Han's father made more calls. The calls reached people who politely explained that the situation was beyond intervention and that drawing further attention to it would be unwise. One of those people, a man 3 levels removed from the Kang Syndicate's legitimate holdings, added a single sentence. "Your son refused to treat a man who was dying on the floor. That man remembers." Dr. Han Jae-won's surgical career at Seoul Medical Center ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with an email from Human Resources on a Monday morning. The director's choice, Dr. Yoon Soo-jin, was not fired. She was given a choice. The hospital's board of governors, several of whom had received quiet, and individual phone calls from representatives of organizations connected to Hangsang Group's parent companies, presented her with two options. Option 1, resign with dignity, citing personal reasons, and the hospital would provide a neutral reference. Option 2, remain and face the external audit's findings being made public, including documentation of her office's systematic dismissal of nurse complaints and her role in terminating a staff member whose actions had saved a patient's life. Dr. Yoon chose option 1. She resigned on a Thursday. She cited a desire to pursue new opportunities in healthcare administration. Nobody believed it. Nobody needed to. Grace had been unemployed for 4 weeks when she heard about Dr. Han's suspension. She heard about it from Jisoo, a surgical resident she'd stayed friends with, who called her at 10 p.m. and said, "Grace, you need to see the news." Grace saw the news. Then she heard about Dr. Yoon's resignation. She sat in her small apartment for a long time, holding her tea, trying to understand how the system that had crushed her had suddenly, inexplicably, corrected itself. She didn't understand. Then there was a knock at her door. She opened it. A man stood in the hallway, tall, broad-shouldered, short-cropped hair with gray at the temples, a charcoal suit that fit like it had been built specifically for his body. "Miss Mensah?" he said, in English, with a formal bow. "Yes?" "My name is Bayek. I work for someone who would very much like to meet you." Grace looked at him. "Who?" "The patient from the corridor. Room 4 in the ICU. The one you saved." Grace blinked. Is he okay?" "He is fully recovered, largely because of you. He would like to thank you personally, if you're willing." Grace almost said no. She almost said she didn't need thanks. She almost said that saving his life was her job, and she didn't need recognition for doing it. But something in Bayek's voice, the careful gentleness of it, the respect that was clearly not performed but genuine, made her pause. "Where?" she asked. "I have a car downstairs." The car drove to Hanam-dong, through streets Grace didn't usually see, past walls that were high and quiet, to a residence that made her breath catch. She was led inside, down a hallway, into a room with windows that turned Seoul into a painting. And there, standing by the window, turned to face her as she entered. She's wearing a black shirt and reading glasses he was removing. Was the man from the corridor? He looked different standing up. He looked like the kind of man that rooms rearrange themselves around. "Grace Mensah," he said. "That's me. I'm Kang Do-hyun. You saved my life with a crash cart and a frozen surgical resident while the chief of surgery walked away." "You heard that?" "I heard everything, including what happened afterward in the director's office." Grace was quiet. "You were fired for saving me," he said. "I find that unacceptable." "It wasn't about you specifically," Grace said. The protocol was wrong. The surgeon was a coward. The director was protecting a system, not patients. And you were the only person in that hospital who did what a doctor is supposed to do." He paused. "I've spent the last 4 weeks making sure the people responsible understand the weight of that failure." Grace stared at him. "The funding review, the ethics complaint, the suspension, the resignation. That was you," she said. "That was the consequence of their own decisions," he said. "I simply made sure the consequences were delivered to the correct addresses." "You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to save me. An unidentified man bleeding on the floor of a corridor. No insurance, no name. The chief of surgery himself decided I wasn't worth the effort." He looked at her. "You disagreed, with your bare hands, on your knees, while everyone else either refused or froze." Grace didn't know what to say. "I have something for you," he said. He handed her a folder. Inside, an employment offer. Lai, Senior Trauma Nurse Specialist at Seoul National University Hospital, the top-ranked hospital in South Korea. A position that normally required a 5-stage application process, 3 rounds of interviews, and a 12-month waiting list. The start date was Monday. "I can't just," Grace started. "You can," he said. "Your qualifications are exceptional. I simply made sure they were seen by people who would appreciate them instead of people who would bury them. Grace looked at the offer, then at him, then at the room, then at Seoul through the windows. Why? She asked. You don't know me. I know that you knelt on a hospital floor and saved a stranger's life while the system told you not to. I know that when they punished you for it, you walked out with your head up. I know that you documented everything, every shifted schedule, every denied application, every retaliation, because you wanted the truth to exist even if no one ever read it. He paused. Beck found your file on your laptop. I read it. That's an invasion of privacy. Yes. And I would apologize, except that the file you kept is the reason the ethics board investigation moved as quickly as it did. Another pause. Your documentation was better than my team's. I was impressed. Grace almost laughed. Almost. I don't need a savior, she said. Good, Do-hyun said. I don't save people. I correct imbalances. You saved me. That created a debt. They destroyed your career for it. That created an injustice. I addressed both. He met her eyes. What you do next is entirely your decision. Grace looked at the employment offer one more time. Seoul National University Hospital. 6 senior trauma nurse specialist. Do they know who recommended me? She asked. They know your qualifications. That should be enough. It was. Grace folded the offer and put it in her bag. Thank you, she said, simply. Without performance. Do-hyun nodded. Miss Mensah. Grace. Something shifted in his expression, almost imperceptibly, like a man who had just been given something he didn't expect. Grace, he repeated, like he was filing it somewhere permanent. She turned to leave. Grace. She stopped. The hospital's annual fundraising gala is in 3 weeks. Seoul National hosts it. You'll receive an invitation. Are you asking me to go? I'm telling you, I'll be there. What you do with that information is your decision. Grace looked at him. This man who had dismantled a hospital's leadership from a hospital bed, Nawai, who spoke in quiet sentences that moved like chess pieces, who looked at her with an expression that was not rescue, but recognition. I'll think about it, she said. She walked out. She did not look back, but she was smiling. 3 days later, Grace received a package at her apartment. Inside, a framed copy of her hospital ID badge, the one she had placed on Dr. Yoon's desk the morning she was fired. Attached was a handwritten note in neat, precise handwriting. You left this behind. I thought you should have it back, not because you need it, but because it represents someone who chose to act when everyone else chose to look away. That badge belongs to you. So does whatever comes next. Kate Grace held the badge for a long time. Then she put it on her shelf, next to the photo of her mother. 2 women who never gave up on anything. And that is what happens when you fire the wrong nurse. Dr. Han thought his connections made him untouchable. Dr. Yoon thought her corner office made her powerful. They found out the hard way that real power doesn't sit behind a desk. It kneels on a hospital floor and saves a life with its bare hands. Grace didn't need a Korean Mafia boss to save her. But karma needed a delivery address, and Do-hyun had the postage. If this story hit different, smash that like button. It tells me to keep making stories exactly like this. Subscribe if you're not already family. We drop stories that go hard. Comment below. What was your moment? The firing scene? The funding getting pulled? Dr. Han's career ending with an email? Or that badge coming back? I'm reading every comment. Share this with someone who's ever been punished for doing the right thing. They need to hear this. I'll see you in the next one. Don't be late.